I could talk about winter all day, all week. I've been doing it for 6 years so far, my PhD. But yeah, so my name is Zuri. Like Jalissa said, completed my PhD at Brown in Africana Studies, originally from North Carolina, from Charlotte, North Carolina, which I did not know you had family in Wilmington. So that's, or like lineage there. So that's cool. But yeah, so um, today I'm going to be presenting like kind of my interpretation of Unsettling, the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, and Freedom by Sylvia Wynter. I really emphasize that this is my interpretation because I'm really consider myself to be a wayward reader of Wynter. Wynter herself was really interested in a heretical approach to the production of knowledge. I'm really kind of interested in disrupting kind of some of the orthodox readings of Wynter as we continue to further her political and intellectual project, and what its implications are for the production of knowledge beyond the university. Um, it's important to note that Wynter, before I get started, it's important to note that Wynter did not have a PhD. Um, she only had well, not only, but she had a master. She also does not technically have a book published. By today's standards of academia, that's like unacceptable. Like you don't have a PhD or a book, so we could talk about the coloniality of the book, right? But and of the PhD. I just start with that because I think it's important to also note that for why her work is so heretical and why she's so interested in questions that are completely so disinterested in what mainstream academia was interested in at the time and why she had such strong critiques of academia. Right. I consider myself again a Wayward Wynterian because I like to occupy that same position in relationship to the university. Right. Can we do the next slide, please? So I'm going to try to save some time for questions at the end because I think that's really important. So the guiding questions for us to think about as we are discussing unsettling is from where do intellectuals, particularly public-facing intellectuals, emerge? Um, the second thing is from what, and so when I so first when I ask that question, I'm really asking really a question of origins. And so for Wynter's project as a whole, origins are really important to describing the function of something and to describing how something ultimately is going to be in the world. For her, it's just articulable from the origin of the thing. So if she's thinking about in this article what the function of the intellectual is, what intellectuals do as a class, for her that's tied ultimately to the question of origin. So that's why this guiding question is from where do intellectuals emerge as we're even thinking in our current moment. The second thing is from what conceptual grounds of legitimation do intellectuals think? So very much in line with kind of like this idea of this as being a groundings space, right? And so really thinking about what are kind of those unsaid or assumed kind of like truths upon which every other statement an intellectual makes um, is kind of founded, right? So what are the things that we can't ever question, and those are our conceptual grounds. Those are the epistemological grounds upon which knowledge itself is scaffolded. And then the last question is, what are the political, social, economic, and existential investments of the intellectual class or intelligentsia, and with whom do their epistemic interests align? And so this is really just getting at, again, we really want to think about as scholars or as intellectuals or just as thinkers. And when I say intellectual, I'm really thinking about here, very broad conception of the intellectual. There's the George Jackson, the prison intellectual. There's Sylvia Wynter, the intellectual without the PhD. There's for me, intellectual generally just means a thinker for the purposes of this. But then further thinking about for when specifically for this essay though, thinking about an intellectual class, right? And so really thinking about the class of particularly those that are in the university or those that are in these really paid to think, right? Because that's ultimately going to shape what their investments are, who's paying them to think, what are they being paid to say, how are they being paid to shape thought itself. So yeah. Next slide, please. So Wynter's argument. So I really want to in this presentation, I really want to provide kind of a way of thinking about Wynter going forward because I think that this is definitely an essay that you have to read multiple times. Like again, like this is maybe my like I don't know, 15th time reading this essay, like starting back in 2019 when I was introduced to it by Tyrone Palmer, who's a really important junior scholar thinking with Afro pessimism right now. And I was like annoyed with the way that I was in my philosophy classes. I was an Africana Studies and philosophy major. And my professor was saying that, um, you know, Kant was a, harbinger of human rights and that Descartes wasn't talking about God. He was talking about something else. And I was like, but Kant literally in the text, like said the N word. Like, I was like, why are we, why are we, mystifying the truth? And so that's kind of how I arrived like to this essay. And so I really the way that I've been able to approach it over the years has changed. So what I want to do is really provide, again, my interpretation, some skills of approaching Wynter's thought generally, so that even beyond this, you can move to reading other Wynter essays where she's really delivering a similar argument, but just in terms of in different contexts, right? And so the main argument here, which we can find on page 260, she says, all right, cool. She says the argument proposes that the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethnic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. Um, so the argument of the essay is she writes, the argument proposes that the struggle of our new millennium will be one between the ongoing imperative of securing the well-being of our present ethnoclass, i.e., Western bourgeois conception of the human, man, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, and that of securing the well-being and therefore the full cognitive and behavioral autonomy of the human species itself, ourselves. And so for Wynter, the question of unsettling coloniality is really a question of unsettling the overrepresentation of the racism ethnicism complex. And so this is really a kind of struggle that's occurring on two intersecting terrains, right? So the first terrain is the psychic landscape or the interior, the mind, right? And the second landscape is the material world. And so what she's really getting at is the way that um, knowledge conditions our internal world such that we reproduce the external world in a way that particularly aligns with the needs of man, which is this Western bourgeois conception. And so uh, she's right. And so for her, the 1960s represents a particular challenge to the overrepresentation of man and his particular mode of being, this bourgeois, ethnoclass, imperial mode of being. And so for her, the 1960s was a matter of a challenge in terms of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, struggles over the environment, global warming, severe climate change, and the unequal distribution of Earth's resources. And so one thing I want to note here is that within the academy, there's kind of or within, the discourse on Wynter's thought, there's kind of some of these different claims about her relationship to feminism. And so I want to make clear that Wynter is not a feminist, okay? She is critical of liberal feminism, you know. She is critical of the way, particularly of the way that feminism in the 1960s, or the way that the quote unquote woman question was tied to a broader set of questions that was really trying to disrupt this entire structure rather than becoming a question disconnected from questions of class, questions of race, questions of environment. And so when she talks about, she has an article, which I definitely recommend, where she actually critiques both Marxist Leninist feminism and liberal feminism for not going far enough, you know. And so I just want to really emphasize that is that Wynter is not a feminist. She just is saying that feminism can go even further. And so for me, I really consider her to be in conversation with someone like Safia Bukhari, like in that sense. And if you go to one of her early plays, you can actually see where, there's this struggle, this patriarchal struggle that's going on. And in the play, actually, um, the wife kills her husband for being patriarchal. So it's like, the way she's been taken up. Um, yeah, we can, yeah. I'll actually come to that, the question of genre versus gender. And so yeah, so yeah, just wanted to get that out there because there's a lot of discourses around Wynter's relationship to feminism that are kind of like, I don't know. But yeah, so what Wynter is describing in terms of this unsettling the overrepresentation of racism, the racism ethnism complex, what she's really doing is describing an epistemic struggle that really darkens a decolonial analysis, particularly by paying attention to the deeper function of epistemological disregard of colonized people's knowledges. As Mignolo kind of highlights, right? And so, but for her, the deeper function is really tied to a question of violence and conquest rather than simply it just being for its own sake, right? And so, as we're going to see, the overall argument is that it's not enough to simply just insert these indigenous knowledges, these unspoken knowledges or overwritten knowledges back into. Yeah, so it's not enough to just put them back into discourse, right? Because that itself would disfigure those indigenous knowledges, and then it also would just be absorbed back into this imperial discourse of the human, right? This colonial discourse. um Right. So, and so again, like this question of function, because I really want to think about what Wynter's feminism is doing in relation to other feminism. So, because of her attention particularly to function, um, we can really place her next to someone like Joy James as well, who's really interested in function, and then similarly has a relationship to feminism where she's not a feminist, but she's very critical of these liberal feminisms and even Marxist feminisms for not going far enough, right? And so overall, as we think through this, I want us to think about Wynter as kind of performing a kind of certain type of dramaturgy, where she's trying to think about how the coloniality of being, the coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom, how there's these different actors that come into play, right? And so she's really giving us this bird's eye view of these different actors on stage, this stage called the conceptual ground, as they're navigating and kind of they come to produce these figures of man one and man two that ultimately overrepresent themselves as if their interests are in the best interest of everyone and everything on earth, and not on earth. um, so next slide, please. So these are some of the keywords that I really wanted us to wanted to highlight so that we could kind of relate terms together, right? So I'm just gonna think through, or I'm gonna kind of talk through some of these just so you can get an idea of how they relate to each other as we continue to go through kind of some of the go through the essay itself and kind of the argument. So the first thing is genre. And so, like I said, someone in the comments mentioned genre versus gender. So genre is a particular historical epoch, historical and cultural epoch in which a certain descriptive statement or sociogenic principle is instituted that defines what it means to be a proper subject of society and thus shapes social relations within that genre. So genre is really, we can think about it as a structure, right? As a structure that is held together by these different components, right? And so one of those components is gender, right? Gender is one of the things that contributes to how genre coheres itself. And so again, just to address the comment in the chat, is that it's not that gender is not a part of her analytic, it's just that gender is not a central component of her analytic, right? It's a um it's like we can imagine, like a star, right? And her analytic is composed of like each point on that 5 point star, like that's a component of her analytic, right? And one of those points is gender. So that kind of gets lost sometimes. She is thinking about gender, but not in like a central kind of way, but also centrally at the same time. It's like, yeah. And so the next thing is, so in terms of genre, so within a genre gives us a descriptive statement. And so a descriptive statement, like I said, tells us what it means to be a proper subject of society. And so from the descriptive statement, colonized knowledge production must always function to conserve that descriptive statement. So knowledge can't be produced that would undermine the truth of the descriptive statement, which would risk the collapse of the psychic structure that's supported by colonized knowledge. So in theory, if we were to, disrupt, abolish the architecture of knowledge in our mind, like the structure of knowledge in our mind, the cop in our head, that would prefigure us then going out and abolishing these structures external to us, right? So that's kind of like the theory, or what she's thinking about here as like the causality, right? And so the truth of the descriptive statement, this thing that tells us how we're supposed to be in the world, is legitimated by the idea of an imaginary extrahuman being. And so this imaginary extrahuman being functions as the universal sovereign that grants the temporally sovereign existence of man against the idea of the temporal unsovereignty of man's racial others, right? And so imagine an extrahuman being. In these examples, like I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna break down all of these further in the subsequent slides, but I just want to show how they relate to each other first. So you're gonna get like examples of like the descriptive statement, the imaginary human being, the temporal sovereignty, the space of otherness. But I just wanted to just throw them out here first so we can kind of get on a, it won't be the first time you see them. And so like I said, the descriptive statement is legitimated by the imaginary human being, which is this universal sovereign, and then temporal sovereignty, which is then legitimated by that imaginary human being, is really the power to choose how time will be spent. Is really the time to choose how history will unfold, and particularly how we will narrate the unfolding of that history, right? And so the last thing is the space of otherness. The space of otherness is if the descriptive statement tells us who we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to be in the world, the space of otherness ultimately functions to tell us how we're not supposed to be in the world. And so in this way, there is no descriptive statement without the space of otherness. There is no man without the space of otherness. Yeah. So can we do the next slide, please? And so this whole process that encompasses the descriptive statement, the genre of man, the space of otherness, all of these concepts, they really contribute to this process that Wynter calls, pulling from Frantz Fanon, sociogeny. And particularly instituting the sociogenic principle. So the descriptive statement can also be called the sociogenic principle. Across her body of work, she starts out with saying sociogenic principle, but then because she's moving towards this more dramaturgical model, she then starts saying descriptive statement to try to really allude to the fact that it's a genre of man, right? So she's trying to use more aesthetic language. And so when we think about sociogeny, and I want to read this quote because I think that it really succinctly describes what she's thinking about is sociogeny. So she says, the paradox is this, that for the descriptive statement that defines the human as a purely biological being on the model of a natural organism, thereby projecting it as pre-existing the narratively inscribed descriptive statement in whose terms it inscripts itself and is reciprocally inscripted as if it were a purely biological being, ontogeny that pre-exists culture, sociogeny, it must ensure the functioning of strategic mechanisms that can repress all knowledge of the fact that its biocentric descriptive statement is a descriptive statement. So what she's saying here is that the function of sociogeny is to obscure the fact that the descriptive statement is in fact a descriptive statement, because that disrupts the fact that it's actually not universal. It's actually particular to man. It's particular to a particular class of people who have particular economic, political, social, and existential interests and particular desires and investments, right? And so she continues, yet that such strategic Godelier type mechanisms of occultation, repressing recognition that our present descriptive statement of the human is a descriptive statement, are able to function at all, if outside our conscious awareness, is itself directly due to the fact that humans have been pre-adapted primarily through the coevolution of language in the brain to be a symbolic and therefore a self-representing species. And so the key word here is really, for me, occultation, or the alluding to like the occult, right? And so there's a way that she is trying us to see that what's being hidden from us is the fact that man is not universal, right? And so I think that as we're going forward, I really want us to think about this particular choice of word, why she chooses to say occultation, right? Particularly as we're thinking about her critiquing, Marxism for being too materialist, liberalism for being liberalism, so there's really a certain type of like mystical or a certain mysticism that Wynter is kind of like is getting at here. And this is really why I call myself a wayward Wynterian, because I'm really trying to bring out these kind of like mystic elements of Wynter. These because I think that really, if we're really going to try to get at the, because as Wynter says, the secularization of knowledge is essential to its overrepresentation, right? This idea that spirituality is separate from the production of secular knowledge is false. That's a part of the descriptive statement, right? So yeah. So next slide, please. So, can we do one more slide? Thank you. No, I see someone in the chat, like, if that's allusion to the Matrix. Because yeah, Wynter, like when I tell you, she changed the whole way that I like approached like living. Like I went to grad school because I wanted to figure out how to live in the world, and I left figuring out how to live in the world because of Sylvia Wynter, among other people as well. But yeah, I think that her work is so dynamic. So now we're going to think about these key concepts in relationship to this overall process of sociogeny, and these different genres and subgenres. So the first pre-genre of man. So this is prior to man one, right? So this is prior to Renaissance humanism, right? We're thinking about the medieval Europe, right? And so this pre-genre of man is a Christian humanism. Its descriptive statement is to be properly human is to be Christian. It's imaginary extra human being, so kind of the legitimating force or the universal sovereign that really grants legitimacy to this statement that it's properly human to be Christian is God. The plan of salvation or the redemptive cure, which is again like Wynter trying to allude to these more mystic or religious elements, spiritual elements. The plan of salvation within this pre-genre of man is sexual chastity or abstinence. The temporal sovereignty belongs to the church. So the church determines, how time is going to unfold, what we're going to be doing with how the past, it's going to determine how we narrate the past, how we narrate the present, and how we narrate the future, and thus actualize that future that we've narrated for ourselves, right? And then the space of otherness that, determines, or that kind of, that by contradistinction grounds the descriptive statement, right, is the untrue Christian self. So people who have sex is like and so ultimately, who does Christian humanism serve? The clergy, And so this is why, Wynter's wanting us to think about what are the investments that go into an intellectual class, right? What do they want? Which is ultimately to be in control, right? And so in what way does is knowledge produced and therefore thought itself shaped in order to conserve their ability to call themselves the legitimate heirs to power, right? Um, cool. Next slide, please. So this is where Wynter's intervention really picks up, right? So we move into the genre of man. So this is really where Wynter is like begins her, real intervention into the coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom, of knowledge production with the invention of man. And so man begins in the Renaissance and roughly goes until the 18th century. Though it's important to note that I think, as we're seeing right now, these aren't really they don't really go away. Like, we still have, people who are using Christian, you know, Christianity to legitimate their political and economic and social, plans, right? So these don't really go away, but it's more so about the question of hegemony and what is the general kind of, generally what is the pattern of thought at that time, right? And so, in this subgenre of man one, which configures the larger genre of man that we're currently living in, the descriptive statement is to be human is to be a rational political subject. The imaginary extra-human being is reason, particularly reason as it's granted by the state. The plan of salvation or the redemptive cure is to follow the laws of the state to support its imperial expansion. Um, Temporal sovereignty belongs to the state, right? And so this is actually where Wynter gets into um, this clash between Las Casas and Sepulveda, because ultimately that clash between Las Casas, who has a theocentric or that pre-genre of man descriptive statement of to be human is to be a Christian, versus Sepulveda, who's the humanist who has a ratiocentric, humanist conception of the descriptive statement. It's a battle over how do we define. So either way, they're like, we're gonna expand. Like the state is going to expand. But how do we narrate that expansion? How do we narrate who that expansion is for? How do we narrate what we're gonna do once we get what we got, what we want? And so Las Casas is like, okay, well, this is on behalf of the church. And Sepulveda, the emerging humanist, is like, no, this is on behalf of the state. And so ultimately, Sepulveda comes out on top, and then that, contributes to the development of the continuing consolidation of man one, right? And so the space of otherness is what she calls the irrational indigenous and African descended people, right? That's who ultimately is considered to like not possibly be um uh considered to not possibly ever perform the descriptive statement properly. And because they can't ever perform the descriptive statement properly, we now know that we can perform it properly. That's the logic, right? And so one thing that I want to note that Wynter does in this article, and again, this is where she's really, I think, is pushing up on kind of the classic decolonial, kind of like, I'll say the non-Black ones really, kind of the non-Black decolonial scholars, is she makes this note that indigeneity or indigenous people were eventually absorbed into the category of white. And so in a way, she really emphasizes across the article the way that Black people in particular, Black African descended people, no matter what the descriptive statement is, are in this category of the space of otherness, right? No matter what, African descended people are considered to be the opposite of what it means to be man, right? And even in that negation, indigenous people are able to be absorbed into the category of man, it's even if it's on tenuous terms. We're going to get to that question. So like I said, this article was introduced to me by an Afro-pessimist scholar, but there is some contention around, like, how Afro-pessimist is Wynter, da da da. But that's like debates. I don't really think they're super important, but they're there. But we can talk about that in the Q&A. And so ultimately, what does Man One serve? Man One serves the emerging 15th century imperial class of Europe. Simple as that. Next slide. Okay, so Man Two. So Man Two, 18th century to the present. This is really thinking about the Enlightenment period, and really the rise of capitalism, right? And so the descriptive statement is to be human is to be a job holding breadwinner slash master of natural scarcity. The imaginary extra human being is nature or evolution. And that's particularly coming from Charles Darwin. So this is what, again, in this dramaturgical model, Charles Darwin is the actor here that kind of introduces or makes way for the emergence of Man Two as the new stage. The plan of salvation or redemptive cure is accumulation and consumption. So yeah, that's the plan of salvation is to accumulate. um, the temporal sovereignty belongs to the market. So the market really drives, what is going to happen, how we narrate things, what everything belongs to the market. And again, that's what Thomas Malthus is, again, kind of the actor that contributes to that idea of temporal sovereignty of the market. And then the space of otherness is the jobless, the homeless, the poor, and the underdeveloped. And so again, what's important to note here is that uh, Black people still function as this permanent negative category against which uh, man defines what it means to be human, right? And so she actually says that as such, the marker of that most totally disselected by evolution mode of non-being. So Black people as this mode of non-being that are supposedly non-evolved and unable to evolve. So as such, the marker of that most totally deselected by evolution mode of non-being that each individual and group must strive to avoid, struggle to prove that they themselves are not, if they are to be. So in this way, she's really saying there's a way that prefiguring the capacity to be is actually unnecessary to not be Black. And so in that way, that's a strong claim. She got straight to the point. She got straight to the point. So yeah, and so ultimately, who does this serve? This serves the non-landed capital owning bourgeoisie that's emerging at the time, right? Who don't necessarily have the political power, but have the economic means, right? Can we do the next slide? So what's really important to Wynter's article here is the two culture divide, right? And this is something that's going to come up across her work as an important concept is the idea that the biological sciences and the social sciences and the humanities are separated falsely, right? In a way that the human sciences are presented as, or the biological and physical sciences are presented as being objective, outside of history, not not subject to political ideology. As we're seeing right now, science is deep as a deep state project, which is why it's being disrupted by cuts to certain things and the attempted so she pulls from Frantz Fanon here, who says again to think about this dramaturgical model. Who says that the human sciences have their own drama, right? And so for her, what emerges out of this drama is the two cultures divide. And so she says here, the argument proposes in this context that the still unbreachable divide between the two cultures, a divide that had been previously challenged by the range of anti-colonial as well as the social come intellectual movements of the 60s, before these movements were re-co-opted, lies in the fact that our own disciplines as literary scholars and social scientists whose domain is our socio-human world must continue to function as all human orders of knowledge have done from our origin on the continent of Africa until today, as a language capacitated form of life to ensure that we continue to know our present order of social reality, and rigorously so, in the adaptive truth-for terms needed to conserve our present descriptive statement. That is, as one that defines us biocentrically on the model of a natural organism with this a priori definitions serving to orient and motivate the individual and collective behaviors by means of our contemporary Western world system or civilization, together with its nation-state subunits, are stably produced and reproduced. So all this is really saying, there's a lot here. There's a lot. This is all one sentence. Or no, it's not. She does have sentences that are like that though, where this would all be one sentence. And yeah, I've had to stop myself from writing like that because I'm like, I'm not Wynter yet. But so what she's saying here is that this two culture divide is essential to the coloniality of being power, truth, and freedom. It's essential to the way that that knowledge production is able to maintain the facade that the human is a purely biological subject that then naturalizes social inequity, right? Social inequity happens because nature just determined that that's how that was supposed to happen. That extra human imaginary being of nature said that you were supposed to be poor. And then in turn, knowledge is produced in ways, but because of the separation between the human sciences and the human sciences and the natural sciences, the natural sciences continue on with these kind of like ways of thinking. So we can think about this in a way that, like, you know, I used to do more public health work when I was an undergrad, and the way that, like, you know, we naturalize the fact that Black people have high blood pressure, you know, and it's like, what are the social conditions that go into a particular group of people perhaps having high blood pressure? Oh, racism, not having access to, you know, certain environments, not being able to go outside for a walk. You know, like maybe those things would actually contribute to having high blood pressure rather than just people were born with swollen ankles. You know, like that's not how that works. So yeah. Can we do the next slide, please? So yeah, type of biological determinism. Well, she just says biocentricity, but yeah, biological determinism. And so her prescription is the science of the word, which she pulls on from Amy Césaire, in addition to Fanon, where she really wants us to think about in what ways to really bridge this divide and to really think about turn into a science. I'm gonna just read the quote here and then go from there. So she says, so the second quote here, this would be a science in which the study of the word, of our narratively inscribed governing sociogenic principles, descriptive statement, or code of symbolic life-death, together with the overall symbolic representational processes to which they give rise, will condition the study of nature. The latter as studied, therefore, the argument proposes, of the neurophysiological circuits, mechanisms of the brain that, when activated by the semantic system of each such principal statement, lead to the specific orders of consciousness or modes of mind in whose terms we then come to experience ourselves as this or that genre mode of being human. Yet with this process of taking place hitherto outside our conscious awareness, and thereby leading us to be governed by the imaginary ends or postulates of being, truth, freedom, that we law-likely put and keep in place without realizing that it is we ourselves and not extra-human entities who prescribe them. So what Wynter really wants us to do is think about a science where we really are and she doesn't really provide us like a practical, you know, how to actually go about this, but more of a philosophy of it, of how do we map on these descriptive statements light up this part of the brain. My brain is lit up by these particular. So this is where she's trying to think about the relationship between narrative and biology and the way that narrative works with biology. Because for her, ultimately, humans are not just biological creatures. We're both biological and narrative creatures, right? And those are things that are always interacting, where we represent ourselves to ourselves, and then in turn, that representation enacts something on us biologically, such that now we come to identify with that representation and want to actualize that representation. But the issue is that up to this point, we've been doing that non-consciously, right? So we might, you know, for example, look at someone that doesn't look like us and be like, I actually want to not be like that, you know? And so now actually what happens is my descriptive statement is determined by what I don't want to be, right? And so in that way, we can think about that's why the space of otherness has been so overdetermined by anti-Blackness, right? Because it's been the constant, this is what I don't want to be, right? And so for Wynter, the science of the word would be a way to think through like a philosophy of method to think through kind of how to undo that, right? And so, what are the implications of this? Next slide, please. I love that these questions. What are the spiritual implications? Yes. The implications. Anti-Black epistemologies are experienced spiritually or as an existential imperative. People don't like when I say this. People don't like when I say this. But as we see in this quote right here, what Wynter's laid out for us is the fact that, you know, within the pre-Christian genre of man, the Christian pre-genre of man was a particular structure of consciousness, right? That relied upon religious experience. It was religious experience that structured consciousness, right? And what she's saying is that that structure hasn't changed. What's changed is the content. The form has changed. The form, they're not the form. The form has stayed the same, but the content has changed, right? Instead of it being God, it's reason. But reason is still looked at as a God. She says that in the text. The market and nature are still looked at as gods. So in this way, when we actually talk about the experience of these things, even though they might not be religious themselves, quote unquote, because what is religion? They might not be religious themselves, but they're nonetheless experienced spiritually, and people go to war over their religion. People don't just change their religion. you know yeah, conquistador, like, people don't just wake up and like convert. So, and again, this is what I want to draw out because I think it gets at how we can draw the antagonism in Wynter's work, right? An antagonism that, if we turn to the next slide, what she alludes to here when she says this connection between, again, why she's like pushing on decolonial scholars to think even further, particularly about Blackness and function, is she's like, in this example of Amadou Diallo, she's like, he was shot 41 times. And that's intimately tied to the order of knowledge. That's intimately tied to the fact that African ways of knowing, Black ways of knowing and of being in the world and of non-being in the world are all repressed. And so ultimately, again, if these are experienced as religious or as spiritual experiences, as existential imperatives, then epistemology is a question of violence. Epistemology is a question of metaphysical violence, a question of spiritual violence, that then manifests as a type of physical violence, right? And the next slide, I'm going to wrap up here. To be or not to be. So, Wynter says that intellectuals are ultimately meant to just echo the class of man, right? And that we have these biocentric paradigms that we are basically pledge allegiance to. But this is where I get a little bit wayward, right? Because I want to think about, in what ways are we not only forced to be biocentric, but in what ways are we also forced to be ontocentric? So in what ways are we first forced to enslave ourselves to being, right? So here she says that the politics of being, that really what we're engaged in is the politics of being, right? Or the politics of what it means to be human in the world, the descriptive thing of what it means to be human. But in this way, what I'm thinking about is the way that, again, can we take this a step further to think about ontocentrism that maybe comes out in the way that Wynter naturalizes gender or naturalizes sex, particularly on page 164, where she kind of says that gender, she says that unlike gender, that race, unlike gender, which has a biogenetically determined anatomical differential correlate onto which each culture's systems of gendered opposition can be anchored. So she's in that way kind of saying that, like, we can actually, she's like, gender differentiation makes sense because some people have penises, some people have vaginas. in what ways is that tied to this idea of being, right? In what ways is that tied to um, because she's so interested in the science and the empirical, in what ways is she still indebted to herself a certain type of coloniality, right? The coloniality of not of being as not just a type of being, but the coloniality of being itself. And so then the last slide here is I want to think through in practice the science of the word. So I'm going to read these two quotes. So the first one is in traditional Yoruba culture, Abo refers to the hidden principles that explain the mystery of creation and evolution. Abo is the esoteric understanding of the invisible forces that sustain dynamics and form within nature. The essence of these invisible forces are not considered secret because they are devious. They are secret because they remain elusive, awesome in their power to transform and not readily apparent. And as such, they can only be grasped through direct interaction and participation. Anything that can be known by the intellect alone ceases to be Awo, right? And so what I want to think through here is if we're trying to think about this transcultural approach to study, this science of the word that brings in these different myths to think about, okay, how can we think about what's universal to all of them? Perhaps being isn't actually universal to all of them. Perhaps there's some things that are actually before being that we can't ever actually, that don't ever actually come into being as such. And by being, I mean, can't be formed. It's something that we can observe, right? And so so that's funny. This is actually a book that was revealed to me like a couple days ago. I was just somewhere and it like stuck out to me, and I was like, okay, well, let me grab that. And then I saw this quote. I was like, okay, perfect. But even that, like the idea that like knowledge production is something sovereign. Like, what does it mean to acknowledge the fact that we actually we are nothing but vessels who produce knowledge on behalf of something else, even, and we're collaborators in that something that's not being, per se. And in that way, we allow ourselves to not simply be, right, but something more than be. And then the last thing in relation to this idea of more than being, this is a quote from Erica Jordan Hollis O'Neill, where she says, as a Black non-binary trans femme, I'm aware that each of these identifications, however politically invested I am in them to varying degrees, also entails a kind of necessary misrecognition that tries to capture the essence of a non-human spirit. And so what I want to close on is just thinking about if we think about the attack on trans, particularly Black trans women, trans femmes, but trans people totally, transness. Um, Perhaps there are deeper implications of why they're being attacked if we think about it from the idea of the science of the word. If we think about it in terms of this sociogeny as in occultation, right? If we think about the relation between sociogeny and the occult, and if we think about, if within this genre of man, transphobia is essential to the genre of man, then maybe there's a reason simply beyond, what we think about why trans people and transness is being attacked so heavily, you know, and so mundanely because of what, thinking and opening yourself up to transness will actually open up in terms of knowledge and unsettling the coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom. And then the last slide, can you do the last slide real quick? Thank you. Thank you for this chance to talk to you all and just share my thoughts on my Wayward Wynterianism. For more, you can check out, I have a journal devoted to Wynter's decipherment practice, where we're trying to think through, this intersection of like, what does it mean of like Black studies and like sociogeny, the occult, and, all of these different things. And you can reach out to me with any questions or anything like that. I just love thinking. So yeah, but thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow.